Greetings and salams, distinguished guests. It is my honor to welcome you to the keynote lecture of our fourth annual Terence Nichols Memorial Symposium, organized by the Encountering Islam Initiative of the Theology Department of the University of St. Thomas. The annual symposium is named in the memory of Terence Nichols, an eminent professor in the theology department here and a pioneer in the whole region for Muslim-Christian relations, who founded the Christian-Muslim Dialogue Center at the University of St. Thomas. The Encountering Islam Initiative is dedicated to creating awareness of Islam and introducing different Muslim voices and perspectives and facilitating Muslim-Christian engagement at the University of St. Thomas and in the broader area. For the symposium, we invite a resident scholar every year to address themes and issues that may be important for both Muslims and Christians, as well as for people of other traditions, with the hope of initiating further mutual engagement, conversation, and action. This year, we have the great privilege of hosting Dr. Rudolph Ware, a prominent historian at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who originally hails from this very town, St. Paul, who will share with us...
Minneapolis.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. All right. Our neighboring town. Minneapolis. All right. Yeah, that's right. And who will share with us his reflections on the themes of Islam, Blackness, and racial justice today. Dr. Ware acquired his Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history. His research spans the last 1,000 years, centering in West Africa, while reaching into the Mediterranean lands of Islam and the Atlantic worlds of the African diaspora. A key question that animates Dr. Ware's historical work is, what has it meant to be an African Muslim? This question, examined through space and time, inspired him to publish works on the histories of Qur'an schooling, Muslim mysticism, slavery and abolition, and Islamic devotional poetry. His work is interdisciplinary and combines history and textual studies with anthropology, philosophy, and theology. It engages with both Islamic and African studies, pushing the boundaries of both. An important aspect of the work of Dr. Ware is to offer interventions that challenge misconceptions about Islamic traditions, often rooted in modern colonial Western frameworks, and offer alternative perspectives rooted in Islamic spiritual, scholarly, and pedagogic traditions. His published works include The Walking Qur'an, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa, which offers a refreshing new perspective on the internal logic of Quranic schooling in West Africa and its relation to the embodiment of Islamic virtues. And the edited volume, Jihad of the Pen, Sufi Thought in West Africa, a work that, through demonstrating the vibrancy of Muslim thought in 18th, 19th, and 20th century Africa, challenges prevalent historiographies that speak of the decline of Muslim intellectual production in the later centuries. Dr. Ware is also an acclaimed speaker on a wide range of subjects, including his experiences, including the experiences of Muslim Black Africans, both on the continent and in diaspora. So with much further ado, please welcome Dr. Rudolph Ware. Beautiful, welcome.
So I'll greet you with the universal greeting of peace from my tradition. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Greetings of peace, blessings, and mercy of God Most High upon everyone who has made it to this gathering this evening. The topic that I've come to address is Islam, Blackness, and racial justice. And I'm going to try to keep things simple as much as possible, proceeding in more or less sequential fashion from some framing reflections on Islam, especially in my own personal experience, then to talk quite a bit about some misconceptions about the relationship between Islam and blackness. And finally, we'll end with a discussion of a black Muslim perspective, if we can call it that, on the question of racial justice. But as my brother Fuad pointed out, I'm a native son to this very area, prodigal son, perhaps in a certain sense, been gone for a long time. Staying at my mom's house for the last couple of days, she's reminded me of that. That it's been a few years since I made my way back to the Twin Cities. I did have COVID as an excuse that kept me away. So I'm begging the pardon of my mother for too long of a trip, but we'll start, or too long of an absence. But I want to start actually with some personal reflections about my own journey to investigating these scholarly questions that animate my research and that frame the intervention that I want to make tonight. The first thing that I'll say about the intervention that I want to make tonight is that it was a very unlikely intervention. Okay? If we want to talk about blackness and racial justice, I want to spend a moment reflecting on some of the obstacles that kept me from ever standing in this room. So it's true that I did grow up on the streets of South Minneapolis. Two of my dear friends from those days are seated in the fourth row. You wouldn't believe some of the stories that they would tell you about what I was like as a younger man. But before I even came here, we moved here when I was a small child from Washington, D.C. I left behind my father in the city of Washington, D.C. I did go on to get a Ph.D. My father was a locksmith with a sixth grade education, who quit school to help his father in his locksmith shop when he was 12 years old. I was the first on my father's side of the family to go to college, much less get an advanced degree. My mother, who's seated in the room with us, when she was impregnated by an African-American man, herself being a European-American woman, was told by her high school guidance counselor at the age of 15, when she was carrying me as an embryo in her womb, that she should abort that child, that she would be strung out on drugs and unable to provide for that child if she brought me to term. So before I got here, the grips of white supremacy were trying to choke my existence out before I came. Imagine the position of a 15-year-old girl in 1973 having her high school guidance counselor tell her for racially motivated reasons that she should not have that child, that you should not be born, you should not exist. This is the America into which I was born. And this is the America which put systematic roadblocks, not only in the path of people like my father, but even in the path of people like myself, and especially some of the close friends that I grew up with. So let me say another few things about some of those systematic challenges to standing in front of you in this room this evening. I had the good fortune of being able to throw a baseball 90 miles an hour by the time I was 17 years old. So I got a baseball scholarship, and that's how I went to college. I had a 2.9 GPA in high school. And the reason for that was that books were not something that was important in the community in which I was raised. I was taught as a child, both in D.C. and in South Minneapolis, and riding the city bus, still riding the city bus back in those days to get to South High School with my nose in a book, I could be accused of acting white for being too bookish. The societal pressure was that to be black was to correspond to a particular kind of vision of blackness. One that was essentially, ignorant, uneducated, unconcerned with things of intellectual or spiritual value. The things that I've come to learn and teach since then about jet black West African scholars that were writing books in the Arabic language 1,000 years ago. Jet black West African scholars that were using the Arabic script to write books in African languages 1,000 years ago. These things had been systematically hidden from me, concealed from me, to keep me from ever interrogating who I actually am and where I actually come from. Because a particular kind of blackness is what America cultivates. A particular kind of performance of a racial identity that allows people to become commodities in the instance of slavery, objects to be moved around for political and economic gain. And I was born into that system without any kind of conscious ability to reason my way out of it. So now I'll tell you a more hopeful story, since I see that depressed look on all of your faces that my undergraduate students get when I tell these stories. If you've ever read the Qur'an, I'm going to give you guys a roadmap of where I go. The Qur'an alternates in very systematic fashion between warnings and glad tidings. So we're moving from the warnings to the glad tidings. When I was 15 years old, I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X. The Autobiography of Malcolm X remains, in my estimation, the most powerful work, the most powerful narrative of spiritual redemption that exists in the English language. You can keep Milton. Keep Paradise Lost, Pilgrim's Progress, whatever you want. There is not a more powerful narrative in the English language that tells the story of a person being in very dark places, under the thumb of white supremacy. No knowledge of any capacity to be more than that which an oppressive, dominant society has slotted for him. This was Detroit Red. Malcolm Little. And when I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X, I recognized elements from my own life story, from my father's life story. I reflected on the fact that until we moved to South Minneapolis, and it was our third year in South Minneapolis, I was 9 years old, for the first time in our lives that we lived at the same street address for an entire calendar year. We had never had a home in that sense, moving from one apartment to another, sometimes evicted, sometimes put out, sometimes in a battered women's shelter, sometimes not sure where we were going to sleep, sometimes staying with relatives. So I could relate to Malcolm's story. I could relate to Malcolm's struggle. I understood Malcolm's pain. And already by 15, I had been into some of the things that Malcolm was into. Don't ask Sean Young or Corey Smith about what I was like in high school. So that powerful narrative about how God could find Malcolm in the darkest of places and elevate him out was a thing that provided inspiration for me. I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X cover to cover in one night. When I put that book down, I got on my school bus with no sleep, and I went to the library before school started, and I checked out an English translation of the Qur'an. Malcolm had introduced me to Islam as an ethical and metaphysical system, a system of spirituality and character development that could provide a path out of what I knew that could lead me to the evolution of a higher self. So I read this English translation of Qur'an cover to cover the next night. So I was up for 2 straight days without sleep, and I fell asleep and missed my school bus and didn't go to school the next day. And I came to my mother and I told her that I'm Muslim. My Catholic mother, who still does spiritual direction in the Catholic tradition, in the St. Ignatian tradition. And I explained my reasons for this, and she said, okay, good. And I said, I need you to drive me to a mosque so I can make my shahada, my testification of faith. So she said, I'm busy right now. And we scheduled an appointment to drive to the first mosque that I found in the phone book, which was the Islamic Center in Fridley, Minnesota. And I took shahada at 15. That was the beginning of a journey into Islam as an ethical and spiritual system to heal the damage that white supremacy and racism had imprinted upon me, to try to undo the trauma of what America had taught me about my self-worth or lack thereof, about my prospects or lack thereof, about what I could and couldn't be. This was an avenue towards freedom. Age 15. By the time I got my driver's license at age 16, and until the time that I graduated early, I graduated at 17 and a half, I was stopped by police in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Hopkins, and St. Louis Park 17 times before I passed my 17th birthday. Driving while black, never ticketed. Just because I had found an inner path out did not mean America was going to take its foot off of my neck. Now, did it? A few blocks away from the site that George Floyd was murdered, I was telling this story reminding a friend of this story. I had a police officer put his pistol directly on my head almost at that spot in one of those traffic stops. When he asked me to produce identification, and I reached inside my starter jacket to produce, now I dated myself, I reached inside my starter jacket to produce the identification that he had just requested, and as soon as I reached for it, a gun was on me. America wasn't going to let up on me any more than it had let up on my father. The only pictures that I ever saw of my father in a suit were days that he was dressed up to go to court for beatings that he had taken from the D.C. police. He was going to court with bruises on his face, looking like Rodney King, to keep himself out of jail. Those are the only surviving pictures I have of my father in a suit. America wasn't going to stop. So what was going to be my response? To turn to the ethical, spiritual, and cultural resources that Malcolm was guiding to me through that autobiography. And this meant not only coming to terms with Islam as a system of religious meaning, but also to try to understand my place as a black person in that tradition. And here I was to be bitterly disappointed, because I encountered more direct and overt racial prejudice from the non-black Muslim community than I had encountered from white people. Arab and South Asian Muslims were more dismissive of me as a black person to my face than white people had ever been. Imagine the trauma that you're envisioning moving into a world beyond race, because that's what Malcolm offers as the possibility at the end of the Autobiography of Malcolm X. He talks about making the pilgrimage and sitting with Syrian Muslims that would be what we would describe as white, jet black West African Muslims, and every shade in between, and being one common human family. And here I had accepted Islam and encountered the same devilry that had been foisted upon me by the broader society. Bitter, disappointment. Again, Malcolm provided a roadmap. Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz said once, if a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits. Sounds funny, doesn't it? What is he talking about? He then continued, and he said, you call yourself, he was speaking in the 60s, he says, you call yourself a Negro, but show me Negro land on a map. Negro, you come from Africa. Call yourself an African. If a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits. If Africans have children under the circumstances of bondage in America, you don't call them Negroes. Call them Africans. Malcolm's call was not just to a return to Islam as a foundational ethical system, but to turn to Africa for healing from the trauma of what America had done. It took a while for me to wrap my head around this. I went to George Washington University on a baseball scholarship. I found out when I was there that I was better at school than baseball. I quit the baseball team. One semester of room and board, I quit school because I couldn't afford to pay for it. And I worked odd jobs. I played minor league baseball. I tried to find my way to what I would do. And on a 16-hour bus ride from Minneapolis to Saskatoon with the now defunct Minneapolis Loons minor league baseball team. Remember, if you raise your hand if you remember the Minneapolis Loons. Good. Exactly. That's about as many people as I expected to remember it. I was a pitcher for the Minneapolis Loons in 1994. And on a road trip, because I was still that same bookish Negro that I had been on those Minneapolis city buses, while the guys on the team are passing tequila bottles and girly magazines up and down the aisle. This was before pornography was searchable on your phone, so they actually used girly magazines. So they're passing tequila bottles up and down the aisles and girly magazines, and here I am hunched over books. One book in particular. A book that I had checked out from the Minneapolis Public Library and which I still have. I never returned. I often show this in my classes. It looks beat up. You can tell, right there on the back, Dewey Decimal System and all, is the Minneapolis Public Library's imprint on it. And that book was African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality by Sheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese scholar who wrote these incredible arguments about the relationship between ancient Egypt and sub-Saharan African civilization. He gave me this entirely different perspective that by returning to the study of Africa, that I could reconstruct a past before this happened. Before Derek Chauvin puts his knee on the back of George Floyd, before those cops put their billy clubs on the head of my father, before that cop put his gun barrel to my head, that there was something to being black that was completely separate and distinct from oppression or resistance to oppression. That there could be an expression of blackness and the cultural genius of African people that was not tethered to resisting this dominant system of white supremacy. I was hooked. I read African Origin of Civilization, and they offered me a contract to come back with the Loons. I said, no, I'm going back to school. I enrolled at the University of Minnesota. I told you that I had been a bad student up to that point. From that point on, it was a 4.0 on everything. I got into every school that I applied to. Harvard let me in. Yale let me in. My mom wanted me to go to Stanford. No. I went to the University of Pennsylvania because the University of Pennsylvania had the professor that was most accomplished in teaching African history at that time. I took him as my personal mentor, and I got to the business of learning my people's history. So now we'll move into the blackness component of the evening. We've been in the Islam component so far. Writing books on the history of Islam in West Africa, about African understandings of Islam, there's a number of basic informational points that I always have to give to an audience, so I won't spare you those basic informational points. The version of Islam that you guys have been showed is a massive distortion. The face of Islam that you get in your popular media representations of what a Muslim is or looks like is probably going to be somebody that's vaguely Middle Eastern or perhaps South Asian in origin. Right down to the present, the largest ethnic contingent in the American Muslim community is African Americans. African Americans are the largest ethnic contingent in the American Muslim community. A quarter of the Muslim community. It's actually not close with respect to those other ethnic populations. The second largest contingent in the American Muslim community is European Americans, not Arab or South Asian. But African Americans are still the largest ethnic contingent within the American Muslim community. But that's not the story that we see represented, because Islam is tethered to Arabs in the popular imagination, not just with respect to the way that we understand Islam in America, but also with the respect to the way that we understand Islam in Africa. I did a faculty workshop earlier in the day, so the faculty that were here will pardon me for hearing some of the same facts that I gave them earlier. But Africa is the only continent that has a Muslim majority. Okay, there are more Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa than there are in North Africa by a factor of 2.5. There are 350 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, what we used to call Black Africa. Okay, there are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. There are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. There's a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. The African contribution to Islamic history goes literally from the very beginning of Islamic time, when an African Christian king, the Negus of Abyssinia, accommodated Muslim migrants in 615 and 616 CE, before Islam is even established in the city of Medina and the Muslim clock begins. The year 1 in the Islamic calendar is 622 CE. Well, Islam is already established in Black Africa before that. But that's not the way that academics tell the story of Islam, and it's not the story of Islam or of African history that exists in our popular imagination. We actually don't think about Islam and African history as being connected, because Americans filter everything through the lens of race. Therefore, Islam is the property and proper expression of the Arab genius. And when we want to investigate what Islam is and means, we turn to Arabs. The truth of the matter, in a historical sense, is that the first time that the Muslim call to prayer was made on these shores, it was made by Africans. The first time that people made prostrations in what becomes the United States of America, there were enslaved African Muslims that prayed here. African Muslims brought the Islamic tradition to North America. There are documented instances of African Muslims who are literate in multiple languages keeping plantation records for their masters because their masters were illiterate. And they could write multiple languages with the Arabic script. There are documented instances of functioning Qur'an schools in Lima, Peru in the 18-teens, of free Muslims who had been enslaved in Brazil, earning their freedom through wage work and teaching Islam to non-Muslim slaves from other parts of Africa. Huge portions of the African Islamic tradition were actually transposed to our shores, and we never talk about them. I'm not blaming the broader society for this. I'm blaming the Muslims for this. I'm blaming the disregard for the African experience in most Arab societies, in most South Asian societies, in what passes for mainstream Islam today. This community behaves as though Africa is a side note. irrelevant and inconsequential to the mainstream of Islamic history. And this is particularly pitiable and tragic when you understand that the sacred text that orients Muslim devotional activity, that Qur'an that I read in English translation cover to cover in one night when I was 15 years old, is largely a book about Africans. Y'all hadn't really thought of that before you walked in here, had you? But where do most of the tales of the prophets that are told in the Qur'an take place? Where do they unfold? What is the principal setting for them? So let me just set y'all straight on this. I was raised in an African-American rhetorical tradition that prizes call and response. I'm actually asking y'all a question right now. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, that was my mom raising her hand to call somebody. I'll put it this way. This will be a simple one. We'll do a fact-based question that somebody in this audience should be able to answer. What is the most frequently recurring proper name in the Qur'an? No, Muhammad is not the most frequently occurring proper name in the Qur'an. It actually occurs extremely rarely. It's barely mentioned in the Qur'an. Musa, Moses, okay? Moses is the most frequently mentioned proper name in the Qur'an. It's mentioned at least 135 times in the Quranic text itself. Just really quickly, where did Moses live? Ancient Egypt. Okay, let's keep that in mind for just a moment. One of the reasons why it might not occur to us that most of the stories of the prophets that are told in the Qur'an take place in Africa is because the Qur'an is, in point of fact, a colorblind book. The Qur'an does not contain a single reference to the skin color or hair texture of any of its protagonists. Not one. Go ahead, look. You won't find one. The reason is that it truly does offer the capacity for that universalism that Malcolm promised. God doesn't see skin color and hair texture. God sees hearts and deeds. So there's not a single mention of skin color or hair texture in the Qur'an. So it might not have occurred to you that many of the main characters in the Qur'an might have actually been black. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had visionary experiences that were beyond just the revelation of the Qur'an itself. He would often have dreams and waking state visions wherein he saw the prophets that had preceded him in the delivery of this universal message that he bore. Would you like to know how he described Moses? He said, in one narration, Moses was the most handsome of the black men. In the most common narration, he said that Moses was asham Adam in color, which means intensely black in color. In another narration, he describes Moses as asmar shadidu sumra, which means deep dark brown in color, or what we would refer to as chocolate brown in my day. Not just prophetic narrations that talk about Moses in this way, but actually the exegetes of the Qur'an, the people that do the analysis of the meanings of the Qur'an, frequently pointed out in the medieval period that there's this particular passage in one verse of the Qur'an that actually makes this point clear. And it is one, and sorry for the Christian theologians here or the Old Testament theologians, it's one of the principal points of dispute between the Quranic version of Moses' story and that which occurs in the Bible. There's a very famous moment in the Bible where Moses takes his signs to the Pharaoh that is tormenting the children of Israel. And one of the miracles, the Bible says, is that he puts his hand inside his vest and pulls it out white with leprosy. Okay? In Surah Taha, the Qur'an says, وَدْمُمْ يَدَكَ لَجَنَاحِكَ تَخْرُجَ بَيْضَاءَ مِنْ غَيْرِ سُوءٍ and ayatan ukhra. God gives the command to Moses. He says, put your hand inside your jacket. You will pull it out white without disease. Directly arguing with the biblical account for a couple of reasons. The first of the reasons is that the prophets in an Islamic conception of prophetology are free from any major physical or moral defect. It is impossible from the standpoint of the Qur'an for a prophet to be stricken with leprosy. Okay? But the ordinary explanation that is given by the medieval exegetes of the Qur'an as to this incident is that the reason why it was a miracle that Moses pulled his hand out of his jacket white was that it was black when he put it in. Listen, if a white guy puts his hand inside his jacket and pulls it out white, that ain't a miracle. That ain't a miracle. But if I were to do that right now, even bright as I am, y'all would freak out. And that's exactly what the narrative that the Qur'an is recounting says. That it says another sign for you. Along with throwing the staff and having the staff consume the prestidigitation of the magicians that were in the employ of Pharaoh. Now, as a professional practicing historian of Africa with a Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania, I will tell you that there has not been any serious debate about the racial identity of the ancient Egyptians amongst professional historians of Africa for 40 years. Every single discipline, every single, whether history, archaeology, anthropology, comparative historical linguistics, all of them agree that ancient Egyptian civilization emerges from inner African origins, and that right down until the period of the New Kingdom, where there's a large influx of Mediterranean populations, that every single ancient Egyptian, give or take a few migrants passing through, are what we would contemporarily define as black people. You can do 23andMe DNA tests, no joke, on Ramses III, who is either the pharaoh that tormented Moses or a close relative of the pharaoh that tormented Moses. And the majority of hits come back with Central, Southern, and West Africa. Comparative historical linguistics has shown that the Afro-Asiatic language family, which eventually gives birth to the ancient Egyptian language, also to the languages that are spoken in Ethiopia, and also to one tiny branch of languages that are spoken outside of the African continent, the Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family tree, that these all are traced back in their origin to a single language community that was spoken in the interior of the Horn of East Africa 15,000 years ago. This is a civilizational complex that starts in Inner Africa, moves down the Nile. Ultimately, the Semitic branch moves out before, in later times, the ancestors of contemporary Jews come back into Africa. Whatever they may have looked like when they came back in, and the Quranic and biblical versions that are very, very similar. It's the story of Joseph bringing the children of Israel into Egypt. Whatever they may have looked like after being in what we call the Fertile Crescent for many thousands of years, by the time they left with Moses, the majority of those people would not be identifiable for many contemporary Jews. If Moses were to walk into a room of many of the people that follow him to this day, a lot of people might not be pleased with the reaction that they would have. If Jesus were to walk into this room, a lot of people would say, that's not the blue-eyed, sandy-haired white guy that I have on my walls. In point of fact, in the Prophet Muhammad's visions, he did not usually describe, there's actually competing narrations, but he tended to describe Jesus as having lank hair and skin that was reddish in tone. So he's not necessarily what we would think of as a black person according to the visionary experiences of the Prophet. But let me return back to this interrogation of blackness on the basis of the Qur'an itself. How many of the Qur'an stories take place in and around ancient Egypt? The bulk of them. And the ones that don't take place in ancient Egypt take place with ancient Egyptian characters that are foundational to the narrative. Where does Hagar, the mother of the Arabs, come from? Ancient Egypt. What did Solomon and David look like 300 or 400 years after the Exodus, if the children of Israel were in that time significantly darker than they are today? Many of the stories about the pre-Islamic prophets are rooted actually in African history. And if you study African history, you can find resonances with the Quranic text at multiple levels. I can't go into all of the details about them. I do online community education course called the African Qur'an, where we literally read through the Qur'an with contemporary historical research on Africa in it. I want to pick up on one thread to move into the racial justice component of our conversation: Islam, blackness, and racial justice. And we'll grab a thread that has already been put into the conversation, and that is this term, Adam. Adam is the only partial exception to the perfect color blindness of the Quranic text, because the name Adam in ancient Arabic means dark brown or black in color. And in fact, the philologists of the ancient Arabic language say that this term Adam, when applied to human beings, never means anything other than someone who exceeds dark brown in the darkness of their skin color. So the one partial exception is that our common human ancestor, Adam, is described by the Qur'an as a black man. The same way that modern historical research has determined that the first time that the human being as the human being comes into existence, it is certainly a black person in the continent of Africa. Perhaps this is a part of the Qur'an's coded language to tell a story about where we all come from, that we all descend from this black ancestry. So now, let's tell the Quranic story of when Adam was made. In the Quran, as in the Bible, God creates through speech, right? How does God create in the book of Genesis? God says, "Let there be light." So there's light, right? The way that the Quran describes this is with the following formulation. It appears 4 times in Quran. إِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. When God wants to decree a matter, he has only to say unto a thing, be, and it is. So God creates through speech acts. God speaks the world into being. But is this the way that God made Adam? Somebody's shaking their head. Come on, speak up. No. How does God make Adam? God makes Adam with his own 2 hands. This has made theologians in the Islamic tradition furious because one of the basic principles of Islamic theology is that God has no body and no attributes of body. God has no physical body. So what does it mean that God made Adam with his own 2 hands? But very clearly in Surah Al-Sad, 38th chapter of Quran, 75th verse, God says to Iblis, who will eventually become Satan, who will fall, he says, after he has commanded all of the assembly of the high to bow to Adam, to the frame of that black ancestor for all humanity, and Iblis has refused, God says, "Why did you not bow to that which I made with my own 2 hands?" A great Sufi mystic thinker, Ibn Arabi, once said that it is not anthropomorphism to say that God has 2 hands. God describes himself as having 2 hands. His hands are real. Yours are the metaphor. If God says he has hands, then he has hands. I would add to this characterization on the basis of the way that Sufism is usually taught in West Africa. Ibn Arabi was Andalusian in his teaching. Is that these are not metaphorical hands, rather these are metaphysical hands. The Qur'an says of the human being that indeed I made the human being in the best of forms. The best of forms. Ahsan taqweem, exactly. In prophetic narrations, the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, indeed God made Adam in his own image. And is this not like what the Bible says as well? So what is this black human form that is somehow a physical mirror for the metaphysical essence of the divine? Only God knows that. But for sure, the human body bears some kind of special relationship with the divine essence that isn't discussed in relation to anything else in creation. Everything else in creation is made with this act of speech, discourse, an externalizing act. The speaker separates themselves from that which is spoken, and that which is spoken comes into being. So what does it mean then for God to say, I made him with my own two hands? That there is a kind of intimacy, a kind of immediacy to the crafting of the human being, which is not appropriate to describe anything else in creation. And if that weren't clue enough, how is the lifeless figure of this black human ancestor animated? It's the same in both versions of the story, correct? What happens? Come on. I get tired of listening to myself talk. I know that's hard for y'all to believe, but it's true. Huh? God breathes his ruh in the Qur'an. The ruh is the spirit, completely distinct in an Islamic conception from the soul. The soul is the nafs. The ruh is the spirit, and these are distinct parts of the human being. The spirit is uncreated, comes from the realm of the divine, does not need sleep, does not need nourishment, never tires. It is like in its nature unto the angels. The lower soul, or the ego, is the place for your personal ingrained habits and personalities, your, well, let's just say it, dysfunctional psychoses, the guidance of the nafs out of its, exactly, the ego. The ego is a very simple way to translate what nafs is, a Quranic standpoint. So that's not what we're talking about with the breathing of this divine breath. Two different chapters, or two different verses of the Qur'an, God says, and indeed when I have fashioned him and breathed into him of my breath, fall down before him prostrate. The exegetes of the Qur'an are of disputed opinion in how they explain what happens next. So the first part is to understand that all of the angels bowed when they were commanded. And Iblis, who becomes the devil, refused to bow. This is another point of departure between the Islamic tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the devil is a fallen angel. If I understand it right, I don't be reading the Bible like that. But that's the way I heard it. And no one's corrected me on it yet, so I'm going to assume that that's the way that story goes. The Quran is explicit in saying that Iblis was amongst the jinn. He's not an angel. He's present in the gathering of the high. And when the angels all bow to the frame of this, our common ancestor Adam, and by the way, where this is all going, just so that you get a clear sense of this, the Quran's most radical argument for racial justice is also its simplest. You are all the children of Adam. And it is from dirt that you were created. Nothing ennobles you except the divine caress. Nothing in your lineage, nothing in your background, none of that. But we'll get there in a moment. So Iblis is there, and he refuses to bow. So what does he say in response to God's direct question? Why did you not bow to that which I made with my own two hands? The Quranic version of the story is as follows. I'm better than him. You made me from fire. You made him from clay. Let that sink in for a moment. in the cosmological historiography, in other words, in the cosmic history writing that the Qur'an presents, Iblis is the first racist in history. Iblis is the first racist in history because no other created being has ever claimed, on the basis of their bodily composition and their lineage origin, to be superior to another created being. This is a powerful argument that the Qur'an is making. The Qur'an, if we would read it and understand it in the light of the world that we live in, is saying that racism is devilry. That it is of satanic origin, and it is not, in point of fact, innate in our condition as human beings. In the approach to teaching Islamic humanism in West Africa, there's a concept that is very heavily focused on, that is often kind of skipped over in instruction in other parts of the Muslim world, and this is the concept of fitra, the innate natural disposition of humanity. The innate natural disposition of humanity is not fallen. It is not a state of sin, and there is no concept of original sin. The idea is that the innate disposition of the human being is goodness and soundness because the human being has been made and crafted by God. The human being in its fitri state is sound, and it has a relationship, a special relationship with that divine essence. Just understand this. God is saying that I made humanity with a caress, and I animated humanity with a kiss. Do I not love you? Unlike everything in creation. So the human being, when it's in its right mind, is the way that we would say it, is not going to rank itself hierarchically against other beings made of dirt. That's nonsensical. Why would a creature made of dirt rank itself hierarchically on the basis of its origins with respect to other beings that are made of dirt? No. This is not in our innate natural condition. This is a satanic attack. This is a spiritual force that is trying to get us to see one another with the same contempt that the devil has for us as a species. To try to divide us and to get us to see branches of the human family as less than, to repeat his own original sin. That's the original sin in the creation story. It's not ours, it's the devil's. One of the great West African scholars who has been a lifelong inspiration for me since I learned about him in my first trip to Senegal in 1996 is a Senegalese scholar called Ahmadou Bamba. Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba is the author of no less than 200 books in the Arabic language. And Arabic was his third language. He spoke Wolof and Fula before he learned Arabic. 200 books in the Arabic language. Some of them collections of as many as 200 poems. Some of those poems containing as many as 5,000 lines of verse. Here I was riding the bus thinking that I was favoring my white half by reading books, when Ahmadou Bamba had already penned tens of thousands of pages. Never went to any European school. Only African. He never went to any Arab school. He only ever learned in Senegal from other African scholars. So Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, in one of these magnificent works that he writes, he says, never forget that it was arrogance that caused the fall of the devil. So Bamba classed the sin of racism as part of the overall cosmic sin of arrogance, istikbar, thinking that you're better, that this is just a sub-branch of this broader problem. And he said of istikbar, or arrogance, he said, never forget that it was this that brought low the cursed shaitan. We seek refuge in God from both of them. In other words, from both arrogance and from the devil. And then he said, the cure is to contemplate your body and how it was created. You begin your life as a nasty drop of sperm. You live your life as a walking sack of feces. And you end your life as a corpse, odious and rotting. You are all the children of Adam, and it is from dirt that you were created. Bamba's message was to remind us that anybody that claims superiority on the basis of their lineage or their origin or their background is engaged in the same sinful behavior as the devil himself. They are following the devil's religion. We go looking for Satanism with goat heads, pentagrams, looking for sacrifices in the woods. No. The Qur'an says that the devil is to you a manifest enemy, that he's out in the open. The devil's religion is all around us. And it was expressed in the Arab ethnocentrism that I encountered in the Muslim community, but its greatest historical expression is white supremacy. The devil has never had more adept, fervent converts than he has at this moment. Because an entire global structure has been designed to reinforce the devil's sin, to cause an entire branch of the human family to enslave and to colonize because they're better, because they're more human. This was the sin that I had encountered as a child. This was the thing that terrified me when I became Muslim, is that I couldn't escape the devil wherever I went. Muslims, contemporary Muslims, often look askance at the Nation of Islam period of Malcolm's life, right? The Nation of Islam, was famous for the ideology that all white people are devils. And Malcolm eventually, renounced this as inaccurate, that every human being has the capacity for divine redemption. Every human being comes from that same common ancestor. But I'm going to tell you what, when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad saw what white supremacy looked like up close, he was for sure not wrong in diagnosing it as devilry. Now, was he? So let's return to the story. And I'll start to bring the conversation to a close. The human being, that black ancestor, and it's not just the male version, because the exegetes of the Qur'an remind us that Adam and Eve are made from a single lump of flesh. They're one soul. And indeed, all of our souls are connected. In Surah Luqman, 31st chapter of the Qur'an, God says, indeed, your creation and your resurrection is as none other than that of a single soul. If you only knew, O child of Adam, if you only knew, O child of Eve, that your destinies are all interconnected, that you come from one same place. What is the message that Moses took to that Pharaoh that was tormenting his tribe? In that same chapter where the arm goes into the jacket, Moses tells him that out of the ground the human being was made, and into the ground the human being will be returned, and he's going to be pulled out again to be judged. However powerful you think you are, Pharaoh, however powerful you think you are, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, building a tower to the sky the same way that Pharaoh did, you're going in the ground. You will be returned to the dirt from which you were made. There's only one way out. Every soul tastes death. Chew on that. Now tell us again how important you are. Tell us again how powerful you are. Tell us again that the structures of meaning and oppression that you have brought into being are natural and orderly and that we should obey them. No, you're a child of Adam just like me, and you're going to die just like me. And if you believe as I believe, God is going to pull you out of the ground again and show you everything that you ever did. The Quranic representation of the Day of Judgment is powerful. And I learned about its inner senses the first time that I went to Senegal. For the celebration of every major religious holiday, people greet each other with New Year's greetings because the calendar has turned over for any major religious holiday. So the dialogue goes like this. I say to you, Deweneti, which means Happy New Year. And you say back to me, be there next year. In other words, it's a prayer that you'll be back to celebrate this holiday again. And then I say, Bal Ma'ak, which means forgive me any wrong. And you say, I forgive you, now you forgive me. And then you finish by saying together, may God forgive us both together. And as that student, undergraduate student in Africa for the first time, I'd never seen anything like this. Muslims in this community certainly didn't behave that way. Never saw that at a religious holiday, never heard any such thing. So I inquired about it. And I was told by a person who eventually becomes a dear friend, he said that human beings are the only thing that keep human beings out of the garden. I said, what? He said, well, God forgives any sin that the servant makes against God by you simply asking for God's forgiveness. It doesn't cost him anything. He is the compassionate and the merciful. Any offense that you give against God, if you say you're sorry for it, God forgives you, wipes your slate clean. But God is the just. He will give justice to any of his servants who have been oppressed. Anyone that has had their rights violated will be given justice by God on that day. Everyone. The Prophet Muhammad said, beware the prayer of the oppressed, because there is no veil between it and the throne of God. He didn't say beware the prayer of the oppressed Muslim. He said beware the prayer of the oppressed. So I often tell Muslim audiences that are more guilty of anti-blackness, well, not than like the Proud Boys, but like they're up there, right? I often tell them that, listen, if you are standing silently while my people are being gunned down in the streets or in their beds or being choked out for the color of their skin, then my prayers are against you too. The prayers of all of my brothers and sisters are against you too. And don't be so sure that your testification of faith will shield you from our claim on that day. Why? Because how does the Day of Judgment function in an Islamic conception? You go with your deeds that you've accomplished, your prayer, your fasting, the charity that you've given. All good. Left hand behind your back, ready to receive your book in your right hand. Knowing for sure that you're going to the happy place, to the good place. Until God says, put that hand down and show me the other one. And starts presenting to you all of the times that you were participating in the oppression of his servants. As they come one by one, people that you may never have seen before, that you harmed with your words, with your deeds, with your wealth, with your actions. And the deeds that you had counted in your register, that you were sure were going to carry you to the good place, you watch as they are moved into the account of those who you oppressed. That's the way the Day of Judgment works. Deeds are reassigned in measure of the oppression that the children of Adam subject one another to. Now back to the New Year's greeting. In Senegal, everybody wipes the slate clean with their neighbors. Because if I forgive you of your claim against me, and you forgive me of, mixed up my pronouns there. If I forgive you of your claim and you forgive me of mine, then it'll only be left the offenses that we did to God, and God will wipe those with a simple request. The whole societal understanding of how human beings ought to relate to one another is related to this sense that the principal measure of our ethical worth and our spiritual value is in our treatment of our fellow human beings. Not in the simple accomplishment of the ritual requirements of the faith. but rather that the principal obstacle that will keep us from felicity in the next life is the way that we've harmed one another. And how many of us have dangled ourselves over the fire for our silence in the face of oppression in our very midst? The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, if you see an injustice, stop it with your hand. And if you are incapable of stopping it with your hand, then speak against it with your tongue. And if you are incapable because you fear for your life of speaking against it with your tongue, then at least turn your heart against it. And that is the least that can be accepted of a person of faith. Well, how many of us even turn our hearts against the oppression that is in our midst? How many say that that's their problem, it's that particular community? How many of us treat it as a common human problem? Or how many of us are selective in our application of social justice? We want justice for our tribe. Deeply, deeply hurt when we see Ukrainians chased from their homes. Palestinians, Yemenis, Uyghurs. The list is extensive. And the reason is that there is an empathy gap. We don't identify because we are the victims. And by the way, I'm not just talking about the white folks in this room. I'm talking mainly about the people of color, because we have internalized this apathy. We too have come to see our causes as less than. We see our colonizers as more human than we are, more worthy of compassion, more worthy of empathy, more worthy of mercy. Back to Malcolm. Malcolm said that the problem with the Negro is that if a Negro sees a white man selling ice and a black man selling ice, he's going to think that the white man's ice is colder. We have internalized inferiority complexes. This satanic religion is not something that has just affected white people. It's affected all of us, and it's diminished all of us, because it is destructive of our shared, basic, and common humanity, which is the principal foundational argument on which the Qur'an is centered. You are all the children of Adam, and it is from dirt that you were created. It is only your relationship with these lasting, eternal goods that makes you anything at all. It's certainly not who your daddy was, what he did for a living, how much money you had in your bank account. Because all that's going back to God anyway. Some of those pharaohs tried burying themselves with all of their possessions. Good luck spending it. Yeah, most of it didn't even make it the first century. Good luck spending it. You cannot take it with you. But the basic arguments of the Qur'an is that those deeds, and especially the way that you treated one another, is written in a register from which you cannot escape. The Qur'an describes this in the following terms, that people that didn't believe that this reckoning was coming will be handed the book of their deeds, and they will say, what kind of book is this that leaves out no deed, whether big or small? How many of us are prepared to have our fellow human beings bear witness for or against us? How many of us have done the work of spreading peace, of spreading compassion, of spreading mercy, of spreading justice? I'll bring things to a close with this. Every time the Qur'an uses the expression God loves, the direct object of the verb to love is a human being, without exceptions. It's not just the caress and the kiss in contradistinction to the speech act. It's also that literally every time God says that he loves something, the direct object of the verb to love is a human being. If God loves something else in his creation, he didn't say so in the Qur'an. He never says that he loves angels. He doesn't say that he loves planets, stars, quasars, none of that stuff. Well, why? What is so unique and special about the human being, aside from the fact that it bears this caress, this touch, this imprint, this divine breath to animate it? And all of us, whatever our color, are bearing that from the standpoint of the Qur'an. Well, there's something else that the human being has, and this is also something that returns us to the story of Iblis's refusal to bow. Listen, Iblis can't be an angel according to the Qur'an's version of the story because angels always obey. Only two categories of beings have what we think of as free will in the Qur'an, and that's human beings and jinn, the species of fire from which Iblis was made. There's a particular verse of the Qur'an that says, "Indeed, I created the jinn and the mankind and humanity for no other reason that they would worship me." Well, what does that mean? The Qur'an also says that everything in creation worships God. The stars prostrate, the trees prostrate, the birds sing his praises. So why are these two kinds of creature being singled out and put together in this verse? Because they have the capacity to give their obedience freely, as opposed to having it compelled in their very nature. So I'll ask you a rhetorical question. And I say rhetorical because I'm asking it for rhetorical purposes. I'm not saying don't answer it. You should answer it. Could you love something if it was forced to obey you? Why? It would be hollow, wouldn't it? How could it be reciprocal? If, let's say, and this is the example that I usually use with my students, let's say you have one of those Japanese robots, okay? And it is perfect in form, just like a human spouse. It cooks all of your favorite foods, is fully performing on a conjugal level, all of those things. Don't go too far with that image. But I'm being seriously. It fulfills every need that you have, every desire that you have in a partner, except that you know that it is only doing it because it's programmed to do it. Could you actually love that thing? So this is the basic issue. It is beneath the dignity of the creator of the heavens and the earth to love something that is forced to obey him. The very reason why God brings the human being into existence is so that there would be something in the creation that would be worthy of his love. But with that comes the condition that produces all of the misery and the suffering and the dispossession and even the racism, is that we have the capacity to choose that which is good, lasting, and eternal, or turn our backs to it and choose that which is low, selfish, base, and self-interested. No other price could be worthy of the introduction of this kind of evil into the world except for God's love. This is the condition through which God's love becomes manifest. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, "You will not enter paradise until you have had faith, and you will not have known faith until you have loved one another." He continued and said, "Shall I tell you a thing that if you did it, you would love one another?" They said, "Yes." He said, "Spread peace." He said, "By the one who holds my soul in his hands, you will not spread peace until you are merciful." His companions dared to speak back. They said, "Messenger of God, we are merciful." And he said, "It is not mercy amongst yourselves. Rather, it is mercy in general. It is mercy in general. It is not mercy for just people in your religious community. It is not mercy just for people in your racial or ethnic community. Not mercy for your tribe. Not compassion for your kind. but compassion and mercy for all. This is the transcendent message. This is the spirit that was breathed into the frame of that black ancestor. This is the call. But y'all don't hear me though. You just want vengeance for your tribe, power for your people, elevation for your group. And I'm not talking to white folks. I'm mostly talking to my people right now. My Palestinian brothers and sisters want justice, or do they want vengeance? My African American brothers and sisters want justice, or do some of us want vengeance? The healing that ultimately comes is through the understanding that we are all the children of Adam, and it is from dirt that we were created. Yes, that Qur'an that they read in Arabic and that they think is about Arabs, but actually most of the dialogue is taking place in ancient Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, not even in Arabic. The Qur'an is translating a bunch of conversations from African languages into Arabic so that the Arabs will understand them. And the Qur'an literally says so. إِنَّ أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا لَعَلِكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. We sent it as an Arabic Qur'an so that y'all would understand it. But most of the dialogue that takes place in the Qur'an takes place in the language of ancient Kemet or of the ancient Hebrew people, and in literally dozens of other languages that we don't know. We fetishize the Arabic because the Arab ethnocentrism is hardwired into the teaching of the religion. But if you read the Qur'an, you will actually understand that this is largely an African history book. But I'm not telling you that so that you will put my people on stage, that you will give us center stage. I'm not trying to replace one chosen people complex with another. I'm trying to right a historical wrong and tell you that black people have been hiding in plain sight in our sacred stories, and we have rendered them invisible because of our complicity with this satanic scourge. But the moment that I get up here and tell you that there is something that is special about African people because of this, I'm guilty of the sin that I've come to deride. This is the fundamental basis of Islamic humanism. And without an understanding of the fundamental basis of Islamic humanism, there is no effort for social justice or racial justice in Islam. As soon as we come to understand that the human being is the most noble thing that God ever made, the only thing that God ever said that he loved, and as soon as we begin to treat one another with that compassion and mercy that honors the nobility of those origins and their fragility in emergence from dirt, then maybe we can begin to heal from what we have been doing to one another. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ware, for those beautiful, thoughtful reflections. Now I'll turn it over to the audience for questions, and I can, unless you have a very loud voice, I can come around.
Assalamu alaikum. I have like one comment and one question, I guess. The first comment being, thank you so much for this talk. I talk a lot about Islam and like black people, and I'm always accused of trying to blackify Islam when I just try sharing that Islam is not a monolith, and there's black people and African people that have always embraced Islam since the beginning. But I guess I wanted to know, which it might be another subject, but if you could kind of speak to, I guess, capitalism and like how capitalism can go against like a lot of our Islamic traditions, I guess.
So it's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. There's a very actually direct relationship between capitalism and racism in the traditional exegesis of the creation of Adam. And your question actually reminded me of it. So, okay, here's how it goes, the way that it was taught to me by my teachers in Senegal. So between the time that Adam was made out of the dirt of the earth with God's two hands and the time that the breath was breathed into the frame of Adam, Adam was propped up in state outside the gates of the garden, okay, inanimate. And the devil, Iblis, would fly around observing this lifeless form before it was clear what the plan for this lifeless form was. So the story is that Iblis would take pebbles and throw them at the frame of Adam. And then when they would hit the frame of Adam, they would make a hollow clinking sound. So he began to become suspicious that this thing was hollow. So he went to investigate. He flew into Adam's mouth, swam around in his insides, and came out his backside and said, "This thing is hollow. It will spend all of its days trying to fill the emptiness inside of it. If it's ever given dominion over me, that's how I'll break it." Reflect on that story for a moment. The human capacity and desire to consume is something that can easily be taken out of proportion. Yes, the human being is sound in its state, but it's not capable of its own maintenance and sustenance. It's not self-sustaining. It is not self-sufficient. That's what puts it in a position of servantship to that Lord. So it is needy. It's empty. The devil literally says it's going to be focused on hyper-consumption. That's how I'll destroy it. So now look at the two halves of this story. We've been given a perfectly coherent model of the relationship between white supremacy and capitalism, now haven't we? Just in the story of the creation and the fall of Adam. I wanted to say one other thing that I had forgot to mention about the way that the angels respond when Adam is given stewardship over the creation. And this is also another important distinction. The human being in the Quranic conception is not given dominion over creation. The human being is given stewardship over creation. In other words, it's our responsibility to keep things in balance and okay down here until God takes it back. We do not get to use this stuff or each other however we want. That justice is not just about our relationships with one another, but our relationships with the environment, our relationship with spiritual beings like jinn. All of that is supposed to be kept in balance. We're responsible for keeping it stable. Well, the devil's got another plan. He's going to keep us in this persistent state of acquisitiveness, feeding that desire for endless consumption, and cause us to pursue that endless consumption even when it's tethered to the enslavement, bondage, and exploitation of our fellow noble creatures. People don't like it when I say it, but I'll just say it. For what passes for the mainstream North American Muslim community, capitalism is their religion. Islam is their ritual observance. The thing that organizes most of our community activities are a set of values that are associated with individualist capitalist society. The sunnah, or the normative custom that matters most in most of our communities, is middle-class respectability. Exactly. And I sometimes tell people that if any of y'all had come to our house on any of the nights that my mom didn't eat so that we would, with your Qur'an and a hot meal, I would have memorized Qur'an by the time I was 8 or 9 instead of every single rap lyric that came out between 1983 and 1993. Right? But that the Muslim community wasn't concerned about reaching out to the lowest amongst us then, and it's not concerned now. I'll be blunt about that. We still overlook black and brown Muslims, especially poor black and brown Muslims. We are people. We don't care. We don't extend that compassion universally. We are not that agency for peace. We are not spreading it universally. And the main reason, and I'll just be blunt about this also, is that for many in the Muslim community, The appeal, rather, is to the powerful in society. They want to be accepted, embraced, and adopted by white society. They want to avoid being associated with stigmatized black and brown underclasses. They want to skip right to the top, cut the line. Yeah. Indeed. Well, so God is speaking on racism, but God is not marking race, right? Because race isn't actually a thing. So God won't talk about it, right? God doesn't talk about things that aren't. We had this conversation in the faculty workshop. A word that never appears in the Qur'an is mind. Okay? Aql, or intellect or understanding, never appears in nominal form in Qur'an. Understanding appears in verbal form, but the thing that does the intellection is always the heart. The thing that does the understanding in the Qur'an is always the heart. And one of the things that I'd like to say about this is that, well, if the mind was a real thing, God would have mentioned it in the Qur'an. But show me your mind. If you're going to point to your head, I'm going to tell you you're thinking about your brain, which is a physical organ. But the mind is a concept. It's an abstraction, right? That the Greeks, that we've borrowed from the Greeks and the concept of psyche, which was originally soul and sort of migrates into the place for mental capacity, and then post-Enlightenment rationalists turn it into its own thing. My point in saying all of this is that it may or may not exist, but the anthropology of the Qur'an, in other words, the study of humanity that the Qur'an offers, doesn't use it as a category, which means that it may or may not be a thing. And of course, the Qur'an doesn't use race as a category because that's actually not a thing. There is no biological way of separating the human races. That is done by convention. It's done societally. From the standpoint of pure biology, as from the standpoint of the Qur'an, there is only one race, the human race. I'm not of a different race than you, whatever your race is. We're all Beni Adam. We're all the children of Adam and Eve. So the Qur'an doesn't talk about race because it would reify an imaginary concept for God to dignify it in that way. This is also, for me, one of the proofs that this book is written by God and not by a human being. Because read all those other books, and they're marking race everywhere they go. They're marking tribe everywhere they go. God isn't thinking about people in that way. That's not a salient distinction from the standpoint of the creator of humanity. However, there is a plain and clear warning against following the devil in claiming superiority in this way. And in the prophet's own farewell sermon, the last public sermon that he gives, he says plainly and clearly, there is no superiority of black over white or white over black. He actually says over red, but that's the color distinctions back in those times were different. So black over red or red over black. No superiority of Arab over non-Arab or non-Arab over Arab. This is his last message. He says, in almost the same breath, speaking to his community, he says, the devil has despaired of ever getting you to go astray in the major sins, so beware of him in these other ones. Well, what does he mean? Beware of the devil in dividing you in this way. Look, where do you think colonizers learned divide and conquer from? That's been the devil's game plan since day one. Get the children of Adam to see each other with the same contempt that he has for the whole species. So there's a powerful anti-racist argument without reifying the fiction of race. I saw a hand at the very back. Wa alaikum salam. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is my kind of scholarly research is really focused on this. It's the way that Islamic education functions in a West African context, and that my first book, The Walking Qur'an, is about that. But I'll just summarize in this fashion with actually a quotation from a person who I think is in many ways the kind of greatest living scholarly example of this West African tradition. He's a contemporary scholar of Gambian origin, Imam Fode Drame. He's based in Vancouver now, and he's written dozens of books in English, kind of about Islamic spirituality and ethics and all sorts of topics. And he's got full exegesis of Qur'an in Arabic that has not been published, and we're working on getting that published. So here's what he said on this question. He said that if you look at the substance of educational practice in West Africa, because he was asked, he's raising his own kids in Canada. He said, how do you keep your children getting a sound education? He said, it's very difficult. He said, and I'm not in any better situation than you are. My children are being raised in Canada. And he said, and I had advantages in Gambia that they don't have, which is a weird thing for some people to think because Gambia is, a very impoverished place. But he's saying, I had advantages in Gambia that my kids don't have in Canada. And then he said, the entire educational structure in West Africa is designed to keep children in their fitra as long as possible. He said, that's actually the whole of it. And I was like, damn it, I did 12 years of research writing this book, and he essentially summarized, everything that I had, documented about the way that Quran schooling functions in West Africa in a sentence, which is basically true, is that the whole idea is to, so one simple example, children are not taught to read and write in the beginning. They're always taught listening and recitation first, because this is a much easier capacity and faculty for them when they're a small age. They start to learn the Quran as like a long song, right? And there's all kinds of small ways in which the educational system is just designed to literally keep them grounded in a proper sense. If you think about the human being as being made out of the earth, it's designed to keep them in that state as long as possible. He also said on a related point about the role of spiritual mentors in the Sufi tradition. He said that in essence, the roles of a spiritual guide are only two: help people return to their fitra, and then help them establish their relationship with the word. The expectation is that the word will do its own work once the human being has been restored to soundness. And that is also what's underlying the West African educational approach. Bodily dispositions and comportment, learning through gesture and mimesis, focusing as much on character training as actual analytical knowledge, using the children's capacity to memorize things. I mean, if you've ever tried to memorize text as an adult, compared to like what it's like to memorize things when you're a child, Sheikh Ahmed Ubamba, who I mentioned before, he said that he said teaching a child is like engraving something in stone. He said teaching an adult is like writing on the surface of water. It's gone as soon as you. So you take advantage of the fact that children have this capacity to memorize and to learn through gestures and embodiment, all kinds of things that will only later dawn on them their deeper meanings. And this came up in interviews that I had with men and women who had grown up in Quran schools. They often talked about the fact that when they were young, they didn't understand the meanings of any of the words that they were, reciting, but they internalized it and it had a set of associations, so that then later when they learned the Arabic grammar and started to understand what was actually being said, they already had the entirety of the book inside them. And they could reproduce it through automatic recall and apply it to any situation. So it's very much a kind of processual and initiatory approach. You use the relevant building blocks that are appropriate to a child's age to prepare them for the next stage. So that a lot of it is just memorization, mimesis, copying the sounds, and you slowly but surely introduce critical thinking and other faculties into it as it goes. But don't just overload, the system with reading and writing and, a bunch of teaching. Just, proceed in a slower, more processual fashion than that. Yeah, I saw a hand up here. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Man, how much time you got? Yeah, y'all might want to leave if y'all got somewhere to be, Yes, sir. Yeah.
I was really excited. Like I would be in the streets of Minneapolis and I would greet every Muslim that assalamu alaikum, whatever. And then I would get these looks like. And so like it's been kind of a disappointment in some senses in that regard to some of the things that you talked about. So do you have any insights on maybe some of the things that we can do as a ummah to maybe come together and erase some of the things that should not be there?
Okay, yes, but before we get to the glad tidings, I'm going to hit the warnings real quick. So my brother-in-law, so this is the brother of my ex-wife, a number of years back, this must have been in the late 90s, became interested in Islam, not really through dialogue with me, just through kind of his own seeking. He was going through certain things in his life and was kind of going through a spiritual awakening. So without any contact with Muslims, he had read and had made resolved within himself that he was going to take Shahada and convert to Islam. So he was in Decatur, Illinois, when this happened. So he, just like I had a number of years before that, like looked up in the phone book the mosque, and he went to go to make his Shahada. And the only mosque in town was predominantly South Asian mosque, few Arabs, no black people really prayed there. So he arrived at the door of this mosque with a throwback jersey, cornrows, and sagging jeans, and was stopped at the door. He had come to take his Shahada, and he was told at the door, "We think you may be in the wrong place." Those were the exact words that he said over the phone to me in relating his experience. Now, and I'm just going to say this, every single African American Muslim can tell you a story like that. Every single African American Muslim can tell you a story like that. The truth of the matter is that the state of racial consciousness and awareness in the quote-unquote mainstream Muslim community is where white people were in the 50s and apartheid South Africa was in the 80s. Imam Makram, I heard you. Would you speak on it? This is my good friend Imam Makram El-Amin. He's the Imam at Masjid al-Nur on the north side, and someone I've known for a number of years who I greatly respect. And you had the similar response, so I would like you to elaborate.
It's a shared experience that, though it's not necessarily talk, it's definitely table talk amongst African Americans, but it's something that is not always shared. More and more is being shared now.
Yeah.
But this is common talk amongst African Americans.
Exactly, and so thank you for putting it in those terms. I gave a lecture at the first annual African American Muslim Conference this was in Diamond Head, California, must have been 2018. And I was approached by a group of graduate students after the talk ended and was told that so this was all African American and African, but mostly, predominantly African American male and female scholars from all over the country that came and gave different presentations. The place was packed. And I was told by this small group of graduate students that the talk that I gave was the only one that centered anti-black racism in the Muslim community as a topic of active discussion. And I said, really? I mean, because I hadn't been to all the talks. I was at my talk, so I couldn't go to all of them. And they said, yeah, it's not something that has been, centered in any of the conversations. And then one of them said to me, do you know why that is? And I said, well, I think I know why that is, but why don't you tell me? He said, because you're the only one that's not eating from their hands. He said, you have a tenured position at a university. they don't pay any of your bills. So you can speak freely about what we all experience and know. I get disinvited from talks all the time because I'm not putting up with Arab ethnocentrism or, South Asian anti-blackness any more than I'm putting up with white supremacy. I'm going guns blazing at the devil regardless. So part of the answer to your question, brother, is that we need to make this a matter of public discussion, and we can't be fearful about this. We can't. Because we all have this shared experience. I've had people who, so I pray the ordinary West African way, which is with your arms settled at your sides. It's the normal position that's used in the Maliki school of religious ritual. It's the way that most people in West Africa pray. Most people from the Middle East or the eastern part of the Muslim world pray with their arms folded across their chest, and both forms of prayer are understood to be acceptable. But lots of Arab Muslims and South Asian Muslims don't know anything about this, so they think that there's something wrong with it. And oftentimes they assume that because I'm black, that I'm a recent convert, don't know what I'm doing, and I'm making a mistake in my prayer. So I've literally had people try to physically hit my arms into a folded position. And ask Corey Smith and Sean Young what would have happened to somebody that tried to put their hands on me when I was 16 or 17 years old. Like, they were about to catch hands. To this day, it's difficult. So this happened to me. This happened to me not too long ago, and so I literally started to explain. Imam Malik, who is the eponym of the school of religious ritual that I follow, and the narrations around why it's generally understood that he preferred prayer in this position, and that there are hadiths that are narrated about the Prophet praying with his arms folded, but that the Maliki position is actually based on the embodied practice of the people in the community in Medina. It's not actually drawn from textual sources. It's drawn from embodied practice within the community. And he looked at me like I had 8 heads. He had never heard of Imam Malik. He didn't know the Arabic words for for qabd and for sadl, which is the positions of the arm in prayer. In other words, he didn't know anything about anything, but he assumed that I didn't know anything about anything. And it's that kind of cultural arrogance that is just exhausting. And we've all faced it. We've all faced it. So we have to attack it aggressively. I gave a lecture at the Lighthouse Mosque in Oakland, recently on this, and I framed it in Malcolm's terms. And I said that we have, as black people, internalized an inferiority complex. The problem with the black Muslim is that if the black Muslim sees a black Muslim selling ice and an Arab Muslim selling ice, he's going to think that the Arab's ice is colder.
All right, thank you. I think if there's further questions, you can come up and ask Dr. Ware. Stay for it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, yes,
thank you,
and
guys.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a good rest of the night.
As always, man. Alhamdulillah. Hey.